One decision made in silence behind closed Ferrari boardroom doors quietly sealed an entire championship. Not on the asphalt where millions were watching, not during a dramatic qualifying session, not under the crushing pressure of a final race weekend where everything was on the line. No, it happened months before the season even started, in a strategic meeting somewhere in Italy, and nobody in the paddock truly understood what it actually meant until everything had already fallen apart. In 2025, Scuderia Ferrari had legitimate championship ambitions, real ones, not the optimistic media narratives that get pumped out every season when Ferrari shows competitive pace. We're talking about genuine mathematical contention. Their drivers were sharp, the car showed real potential during winter testing. The grid was incredibly competitive, but Ferrari was genuinely positioned to challenge, to fight, to potentially win a championship that had eluded them for years. The momentum was there, the belief existed, and then something shifted. It started as a whisper in the paddock, rumors about resource allocation, quiet conversations about where the budget was flowing, speculation about a massive pivot toward 2026 regulations. But it wasn't just gossip, it was organizational reality. Fred Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, made a choice that would fundamentally alter everything that followed. And here's what makes this genuinely fascinating. He later publicly admitted that it might have been the wrong one. When it became mathematically clear that McLaren was pulling away at an unreachable pace, creating a performance gap that looked impossible to close, Vasseur faced a genuine strategic dilemma. This is the kind of decision that keeps team principals awake at night, because both options carry massive consequences. Do you continue developing your current car package? Do you burn through resources, spend significant budget on aerodynamic upgrades and performance tweaks that might only get you closer but never quite close enough? Do you watch McLaren disappear into the distance while you're pouring money into incremental improvements? Or, and this is the alternative that Vasseur chose, do you throw in the towel on 2025? Do you accept the championship as mathematically unreachable? Do you redirect every engineer, every computational resource, every dollar toward 2026? Do you pivot the entire organization toward a massive regulation shift that's years away, that nobody fully understands yet, that represents an enormous gamble on the future? Vasseur chose the pivot. The team halted development on their 2025 car. They stopped pushing. They stopped investing in upgrades that might squeeze out an extra tenth of a second per lap. Every single resource that could be redirected toward 2026 was redirected. This wasn't just a tactical withdrawal or a strategic pause. This was a full organizational pivot. It was putting a stake through the heart of 2025 and betting everything on a future that existed only in planning documents and computer simulations. And here's where it gets really interesting, because what Vasseur said afterward reveals something crucial about why this choice backfired so catastrophically. He publicly admitted that he drastically underestimated the psychological impact that this choice would have on the entire garage. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. You're a mechanic. You've dedicated your career to Ferrari. You arrive at the garage every morning with one singular focus, making sure the car is fast enough to win races. You're an engineer. You spent months designing components, running simulations, calculating aerodynamic efficiency. You're a driver. You've trained your entire life for moments exactly like a championship fight. Then your team principal tells you, through action more than words, that 2025 doesn't matter anymore. The implication is unmistakable. We're accepting defeat. Not explicitly, but through every resource decision, every budget allocation, every strategic pivot. The message is clear even if it's never stated directly. This season doesn't matter. Save yourself. Focus on next year. When an organization sends that message to its employees, especially to an elite team of competitors, the psychological damage is immediate and severe. Morale doesn't just dip, it collapses. Motivation becomes complicated. Why push yourself to your absolute limits when your organization has already accepted that losing is acceptable? The confidence that's essential for high performance in motorsport evaporates. And once confidence is gone, it's extraordinarily difficult to recover. But here's where the story becomes significantly more complex because the development freeze alone doesn't explain the full magnitude of Ferrari's collapse. Because a professional Formula One team with billions in resources, decades of experience, and arguably the most storied history in the sport shouldn't implode this catastrophically just because they redirected some resources. There's something else happening. Multiple somethings, actually, and when you stack them together, they create a perfect storm of organizational dysfunction. Strategy had become a genuine liability, not a minor weakness, a liability. Rather than building on the team's baseline performance and maximizing what the car could actually deliver, Ferrari's pit wall repeatedly engaged in what can only be described as aggressive gambling. Not calculated risks based on probability analysis, not educated gambles informed by data. These were high-stakes bets placed against mathematical reality, and they failed with remarkable consistency. Let's talk about Austria. The Austrian Grand Prix represents a perfect case study on how organizational pressure and desperation can completely override strategic logic. Ferrari qualified brilliantly, position 2 and position 3. Two cars sitting on the front row. In any reasonable race scenario, this represents a genuine opportunity. Two drivers in podium contention territory. With smart strategy and clean execution, Ferrari should have walked away with decent points, maybe even a victory if circumstances aligned. But here's what happens. Ferrari's strategy team became absolutely fixated on a singular objective, not maximizing their potential finish, not securing valuable championship points, defeating Mercedes. That was the singular focus. The pit wall was obsessed with beating Mercedes, and this obsession led to a catastrophic strategic choice. They committed to an unusual three-stop strategy, a three-stopper, in a race where literally every other competitive team was executing a proven two-stop strategy. While McLaren was managing their tires carefully across two stops, Ferrari were over-pushing, burning through their tires in a misguided attempt to gain an advantage. The result was predictable. Both cars finishing well outside the point range in a scenario where a genuine podium should have been the baseline expectation. This wasn't just mistakes. This was a series of bad calls, fueled by misplaced pressure and an overbearing obsession with beating a specific rival. Rather than maximizing their own results, Ferrari were fighting the wrong race, placing unrealistic bets based on emotion rather than logic. And this pattern continued. While Mercedes was executing their two-stop plan with precision, Ferrari was burning through tires at an accelerated rate, making extra pit stops, wasting time in the pits, and destroying their overall race performance. The result was predictable if you understood basic race strategy. Predictable and terrible. And after the race ended, after Ferrari had fumbled away what should have been a strong point-scoring opportunity, the Vasseur stood in the team debriefing and made a remarkable admission. He said that the team had been chasing an unrealistic race objective. Let that phrase sink in for a moment. The team principal is openly admitting that his entire strategy for a Grand Prix race was built on fantasy, not on race logic, not on mathematical probability, on emotional frustration, on the desire to prove something to Mercedes, on ego, on the belief that they could achieve something impossible if they just tried hard enough. This is where you start to see the deeper issue. This isn't one bad strategy call. This is a team principal making decisions based on emotional impulse rather than analytical thinking. This is a team so desperate to prove themselves that they're willing to abandon basic strategic principles. Hungary should have been different. The Hungaroring is a technical circuit that rewards precision, smooth driving, intelligent race management, and strategic clarity. It's not a track where aggression necessarily pays off. It's a track where the car that's driven smartly, managed carefully, and supported by intelligent pit wall strategy tends to finish ahead. Ferrari arrived at Hungary knowing they needed to show something significant. They were supposed to be major contenders. The championship narrative was still technically alive at this point. The fight was still theoretically winnable. And then everything collapsed simultaneously in a way that was genuinely revealing about the organization's dysfunction. Fourth place and fifth place. That was Ferrari's result. Disappointing doesn't even come close to capturing what that represented. It was devastating. It was confirmation that something systemic was broken. What makes the Hungary result particularly revealing is that it wasn't just the final position that was damaging. It was the manner in which that position was achieved. There were slow pit stops, objectively measurable delays in the pit box that cost crucial seconds. There was poor starting performance, where Ferrari's drivers got a bad launch off the line. There were communication failures at the most critical moments in the race. It wasn't just one operational failure. It was a cascade of simultaneous breakdowns, the kind that suggests deeper problems beyond simple miscalculation or bad luck. The most damaging moment came under a virtual safety car period. This is where you really see the pit wall making catastrophic decisions in real time. Ferrari pulled one of their drivers into the pit box, supposedly a tactical move designed to cover track position against competitors. But the pit wall had fundamentally misread the situation. They'd misunderstood the strategic implications. They'd miscalculated the timing. The pit stop itself was slow. The execution was sloppy. The decision directly surrendered position to Verstappen. And here's the thing about surrendering position to Verstappen when you're already running in lower grid positions. Getting that position back is mathematically impossible. It becomes a mathematical impossibility, not just a sporting challenge. This is the moment where you realize Ferrari's problems had transcended car performance. This is evidence that their operational decision-making at the pit wall had become unreliable. When your pit wall can't execute basic strategy correctly, when pit stops are measurably slower than your competitors, when the communication between drivers and engineers breaks down at critical moments, when all of that is happening simultaneously, you're not competing against McLaren anymore. You're competing against your own organization's incompetence. The Chinese Grand Prix added another devastating dimension to Ferrari's suffering: a technical disqualification, a regulation violation. The car was deemed illegal in a very specific way: ground clearance. The rules state that cars must maintain a certain minimum ground clearance. Ferrari's car didn't meet that specification, so they had to fix it. The solution: artificially increase the ground clearance to meet technical compliance. It's a simple fix, it's easy to implement, but it carries enormous consequences. Ground clearance directly correlates to aerodynamic performance. Reduce ground clearance, you get more downforce, you get more grip, you feel faster lap times. Increase ground clearance, and you lose downforce, you lose grip, you lose lap time. It's a direct trade-off. And Ferrari was already struggling with baseline pace. They were already behind McLaren. They were already having tire management issues. So they sacrificed performance to stay legal. They artificially reduced their own downforce to comply with technical regulations. They destroyed their tire management relative to McLaren. They put themselves further behind than they already were. And Vasseur had to live with that consequence. He had to watch his team get less competitive because of a technical regulation violation that probably could have been caught in wind tunnel testing or simulations. He had to manage the operational reality of a team that was now simultaneously dealing with developmental disadvantage, strategic confusion, operational unreliability, and technical penalties. But the real issue transcended strategy. It transcended technical problems. It went deeper. It was fundamentally human. Early in the season, during races like the Australian Grand Prix, Ferrari's drivers began raising critical concerns to the engineering team. They needed real-time weather information. They needed strategic communication from the pit wall. They needed the engineers and strategists to do their jobs with precision and clarity and responsiveness. They needed to feel supported by the organization. Instead, they were operating in an environment of communication deficits. The pit wall wasn't providing the information drivers absolutely needed. Weather changes were arriving as surprises instead of anticipated variables. Strategic pivots were happening without adequate input or discussion. The drivers were operating blind in critical moments. When drivers operate blind, when they don't have the information they need, they start making panicked decisions. They start pushing beyond reasonable limits. They start trying to compensate for organizational failures through sheer personal performance. Risk-taking. They abandon calculated decision-making and shift into reactive mode. Lewis Hamilton had a moment that perfectly encapsulates this desperation. He was trying to cover track position against a competitor. He was panicked, he was under immense pressure, and he disengaged his pit limiter. Let's be clear about what that means. A pit limiter is a safety device. It's built into modern F1 cars specifically to prevent drivers from destroying equipment or causing incidents during pit stops. It's a safety protocol. Voluntarily removing that safety protocol means you've abandoned calculated risk assessment. It means you're in a state of genuine desperation. It means the normal rules of professional motorsport have been replaced by panic. This is the human cost of organizational failure. When teams fall apart operationally, when strategy becomes unreliable, when communication breaks down, it manifests directly in driver behavior. It manifests in mistakes that shouldn't happen at this level of competition. It manifests in desperate decisions that indicate desperation has replaced professionalism. The pressure intensified from the absolute top of the organization. John Elkann, Ferrari's chairman, watched his team deteriorate week after week after week. Double DNFs, drivers finishing outside the points when they should have been fighting for podiums, repeated operational failures, races that should have generated valuable championship points but generated nothing. The team principal strategy decisions were becoming increasingly questionable in paddock conversations. The car remained fundamentally compromised. The morale was visibly collapsing. So, Elkann made a decision to speak publicly. He made a statement. He demanded that the drivers talk less and drive more. On the surface, it sounds straightforward. Stop making excuses, stop explaining the problems, just execute. Focus on what you can control. Just drive. It's leadership advice that sounds reasonable in isolation, but contextually, this was something entirely different. This was a Ferrari chairman publicly criticizing his own drivers during an active championship campaign. This was institutional friction becoming visible to the world. This was pressure being applied from the absolute top when pressure was literally the last thing a collapsing team needed. It was the opposite of the message a struggling team needed to hear. Here's what happens when you apply that kind of public pressure to a team that's already fragmenting. It doesn't motivate, it doesn't inspire, it compounds the dysfunction exponentially. The drivers feel thrown under the bus by their own organization. They feel like the chairman is blaming them for problems that clearly extend beyond driver performance. The engineers feel their strategy decisions are being questioned and critiqued from the very top of the organization. The pit wall feels the weight of public criticism amplified through media coverage. And instead of creating organizational focus, it fragments the organization further. Trust breaks down. Finger-pointing begins. Everyone becomes defensive. This is where Ferrari's championship truly died, not in a single race, not from a single strategic mistake, but from the accumulated weight of multiple cascading failures that reinforced each other. Let's map this out step by step so the causality becomes clear. First, Vasseur makes the development freeze decision. That destroys morale. Immediately, organizational confidence takes a hit. Engineers stop working with the same intensity because they've received the message that 2025 doesn't matter. Then comes the strategy chaos, Austria's three-stop gamble, Hungary's pit wall miscalculation. These aren't small errors. These are big strategic failures that cost real championship points. Then comes the technical penalty. Ferrari's ground clearance violation forces an artificial increase that sacrifices aerodynamic performance. All of this combines to create an environment where drivers are operating without proper information, without confidence from their organization, without strategic support from the pit wall. So they start making desperate decisions. Lewis Hamilton disengages his pit limiter. Other drivers take risks they shouldn't take. Self-inflicted errors mount. And then, as a final insult, the chairman makes a public statement that basically says the drivers are the problem, that everything failing is their fault, that they need to talk less and drive better. But the reality is that the drivers were never the primary problem. The organization was, the development decision was, the strategy decisions were, the pit wall reliability was, the communication structure was. All of these organizational failures combined to put the drivers in a position where they had to operate without support, without information, without confidence. This is the thing about Formula One that people outside the sport sometimes miss. It rewards precision. It demands flawless execution. You need the car to be fast, absolutely. But you also need the strategy to be smart. You need the pit crew to be sharp. You need pit stops to be executed perfectly. You need the engineers to make good decisions under pressure. You need the drivers to execute without errors. You need the entire organization to be unified and pulling in exactly the same direction. You need institutional cohesion. Ferrari failed at essentially every single one of these criteria. Multiple simultaneous failures. And the remarkable thing is that a team principal had visibility into each of these failures. Vasseur could see them happening in real time. He could review video of the strategy calls. He could analyze the data from pit stops and see why they were slow. He could see the communication breakdowns. He could measure the impact on race results. He could see the desperation building with each race weekend. Yet, the development pivot happened anyway. The aggressive strategies continued happening anyway. The operational failures kept compounding anyway. Because once an organization starts failing, reversing course becomes harder with each passing race. Admitting error becomes more difficult when you've already made multiple errors. Changing direction means accepting that all the previous decisions were wrong. This is the invisible part of Ferrari's collapse that doesn't show up in race results or qualifying sessions, but it absolutely determines them. The psychological component, the morale component, the institutional dysfunction that happens when a team principal makes a strategic choice that might make sense in a vacuum. That might look good on a spreadsheet analyzing 2026 potential, but becomes operationally devastating in the context of an actual championship campaign happening right now. Vasseur made choices that might make logical sense if you're planning for 2026 in complete isolation. But in the context of 2025, a season where Ferrari had legitimate championship ambitions, where they had competitive drivers, where they had real mathematical opportunities, those same choices become actively destructive. They transform from strategic foresight into self-sabotage. The championship wasn't lost in a single dramatic moment. It wasn't lost because McLaren was simply faster and Ferrari couldn't compete. It wasn't lost to a superior competitor executing better. It was lost through self-inflicted damage, through decisions made in boardrooms and strategy meetings, through strategies that prioritized emotional victories over mathematical ones, through a pit wall that became unreliable, through communication failures that left drivers operating without proper information, through a team principal who later admitted he didn't fully understand the human consequences of his own decisions. This is what makes Ferrari's collapse particularly revealing to anyone who understands how organizations actually function. Because it's not a story about talent limitations. It's not a story about individual driver incompetence. It's not a story about a car that physically couldn't compete. It's fundamentally a story about organizational management. It's a story about strategy that became reactive and emotional rather than proactive and analytical. It's a story about leadership that made choices without fully comprehending their human and psychological ripple effects. And here's the most striking part of this entire situation, the thing that really illustrates the depth of the problem. The team principal knew about these failures. He could measure them. He watched them happen in real time. He could review data afterward and see exactly where things went wrong. And then he publicly admitted, after the season had essentially ended, that he'd fundamentally misjudged the impact of his own decisions. That's not a confident assessment. That's not a leader standing behind his choices. That's regret. That's recognition that the path chosen was more damaging than anticipated. When a team principal publicly acknowledges acknowledges that he underestimated the psychological damage caused by his own strategic decisions, you're looking at an organization that didn't just fail at execution, it failed at understanding itself, it failed at predicting human behavior, it failed at recognizing that organizational decisions have consequences far beyond the immediate tactical calculation or the spreadsheet analysis. Think about the different layers here. At the strategic level, Ferrari chose to develop their 2026 car instead of continuing to push the 2025 car forward. That decision, viewed in isolation, has merit. McLaren was dominant. The gap was significant. Looking at 2026 makes sense. But that decision wasn't made in isolation. It was made in the context of an organization with thousands of employees, dozens of drivers and engineers whose jobs depend on success, an entire team of people whose motivation and confidence is directly tied to their organization's commitment to winning. When that organization signals that winning 2025 isn't important anymore, the signal propagates through every single team member. The psychological impact is massive. Then, at the strategic execution level, Ferrari made aggressive tactical decisions that didn't work. Austria's three-stop gamble, Hungary's pit wall miscalculation. These weren't innovations, they were desperation. They were attempts to overcome the car's baseline performance through heroic strategy. But that's not how racing works. Heroic strategy can't overcome a 0.3 of a second pace deficit. It just creates opportunities for mistakes. Then, at the operational level, there were communication failures, slow pit stops, and technical violations that had to be remedied by sacrificing performance. Each of these is a failure. Combined, they're a cascade. And then, at the human level, drivers who weren't receiving the support they needed were making desperate decisions, disengaging safety systems, taking risks beyond reasonable limits, operating in panic mode rather than professional precision. All of these layers reinforced each other. The organizational decision created psychological damage that affected driver morale. The poor strategy decisions created desperation. The operational failures created more desperation. And then the chairman's public criticism created additional pressure on an already fractured system. This is Ferrari's actual championship collapse story. Not a story of mechanical failure, though that happened too. Not a story of driver error, though that occurred as well. Not even a story of a car that was fundamentally uncompetitive, but a story of organizational dysfunction, a story of multiple cascading failures at different levels, a story of decisions made under pressure without full consideration of their ripple effects, a story of strategy that prioritized symbolism over substance, a story of leadership that later admitted that it had made a miscalculation about how humans respond to organizational decisions. And for an organization with Ferrari's resources, Ferrari's infrastructure, Ferrari's championship history, and Ferrari's stated championship ambitions, that's possibly the most damaging failure of all. Because it's not a failure of hardware, it's a failure of judgment, it's a failure of foresight, it's a failure of leadership to understand organizational psychology. And those failures are far harder to fix than a mechanical problem that can be debugged and resolved through engineering. This is the complete story of Ferrari's 2025 championship collapse. The real story, not the sanitized version that gets told in press conferences, but the actual human organizational story of how a championship contending team managed to defeat itself through a combination of strategic mistakes, operational failures, communication breakdowns, and the fundamental misreading of how organizational decisions affect human psychology and motivation.